Welcome to the first of two webinar series for accredited entities on the GCF Integrated Results Management Framework, the IRMF. My name is Timothy Breitbarth, Operations Coordinator in the Office of the Executive Director, and I am joined by my colleagues from the Division of Portfolio Management. This webinar will provide an introduction to the IRMF-related changes in the funding proposal template and is aimed at supporting all AEs in better developing funding proposals in accordance with this updated template. The webinar will last for approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes, including opening remarks by the head of the Division of Portfolio Management, Lilian Macharia, introduction to the changes in the new version of the FP template, and a case study, followed by an interactive Q&A session with a panel of GCF specialists available to answer your questions received before and throughout the webinar. This webinar is organized in 2 sessions to cover our audience around the world. Session 1 starts from 8 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. KST for participants based in the Pacific and LAC regions. And session 2 starts from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Korean Standard Time for participants based in Asia, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and Africa. The content of the 2 sessions is the same. Live remote interpretation to Spanish and English is available during the workshop. Participants are invited to select the language in which they would like to follow the entire event by clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Automated live captioning is also available. Participants are invited to click on the custom live streaming on the upper left side of the Zoom window and then select View Stream on Custom Live Streaming Service. This will open a separate window where you can select the language in which you would like to follow the captions. Please note that this is an automated service, and we apologize in advance if any of the language would be displayed incorrectly. Full video recording of the webinar and the presentation delivered will be posted on the event webpage. Other relevant materials can also be found in the event page for this webinar, as well as across the relevant GCF web pages. We will notify all attendees by email after the event once the recording has been posted online. We hope that you find this webinar useful. And again, we invite you to submit your questions or comments in writing through the chat button throughout the event. We will now proceed with the program, which starts with opening remarks by Lilian Macharia, the head of the Division of Portfolio Management. Lilian?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lilian Macharia, and I'm the head of the Division of Portfolio Management at the Green Climate Fund. I'd like to welcome you to the GCF IRMF webinar series for accredited entities and sincerely thank you for joining us today. As you might be aware, the GCF board during its 29th meeting adopted the Integrated Results Management Framework, that is the IRMF, which sets out the approach of GCF to assessing how investments deliver on climate results and how these results contribute to the overall objectives of GCF to promote a paradigm shift towards low emission and climate resilient development pathways in the context of sustainable development. The IRMF establishes an updated GCF results architecture that outlines the levels at which results will be collected and assessed, that is building on the initial results management framework, the IRMF, and the performance measurement frameworks, the PMF. The IRMF also clarifies the roles and responsibilities for results management and reporting and establishes reporting requirements and processes for monitoring at the project and program levels. In line with the board decision approving the framework, the IRMF applies to projects and programs submitted to the GCF board effective from the 32nd meeting of the GCF board meeting. Now, in preparation for this, the GCF is hosting a series of webinars to disseminate information about the various changes in the accredited entities funding proposal development. Now, the webinar series consists of 2 parts. The first part focuses on the updated version of the funding proposal template issued by the Secretariat, and the second part introduces the GCF funding support to direct access entities, that is DAEs, for the IRMF implementation. Today's session is the first part of the webinar series and will provide detailed guidance on the IRMF changes to the funding proposal template, together with a case project example. Changes have been made in the different sections of the funding proposal, and more substantially on the theory of change and the logical framework sections in order to reflect the IRMF indicators and the results levels. I'd like to invite you today to take this opportunity to familiarize yourself with the updated funding proposal template and pose any questions that may help you better understand the changes resulting from the IRMF on the template and their impact on your funding proposal development. And finally, I'd like to thank you all very much for your participation today and to assure you that even after this webinar series and the Secretariat staff will stand ready to support you during the transition as our valued partners. Again, I would like to thank you and wish you a very productive and engaging session.
Thank you, Lillian, for your opening remarks. I believe this webinar would be a good opportunity for our AEs to increase their understanding of the IRMF and the updated FP template. Now we will present an introduction to the changes in the new version of the funding proposal template for PAP and SAP. Vladislav Arnaudov, Senior Quality Assurance and M&E Specialist in the Division of Portfolio Management of the GCF, and Shahid Parwez, Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist in the same DPM, will present the first presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Tim, for the introduction, and a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who has joined us from different parts of the world. My name is Vladislav Arnaudov, and together with my colleague Shahid Parvez, I will take you today through the main changes in the FP template. Our presentation will be followed by a case study presentation that will show you the practical applications of the IRMF in the case of a hypothetical GCF project. In the first part of the presentation, I'll provide you with a quick overview of the IRMF in order to better explain why there were needs for changes in the FP template. After that, Shahid and I will take you through the changes that took place in the individual sections of the funding proposal. We have also allocated time for questions and answers after the second presentation. However, please feel free to add any questions that you may have in the questions box for this webinar. So let us start with the overview of the IRMF. The Integrated Results Management Framework, IRMF, is a new results management framework used by the GCF to monitor, analyze, and report on the aggregated portfolio-wide results of the fund's investments. The IRMF was adopted by the board at its 29th meeting and replaces the existing GCF Result Management Framework, RMF, and Performance Measurement Frameworks, PMF. As per the board decision, the IRMF is mandatory for all funding proposals submitted for approval for B32 or any subsequent board meetings. This slide summarizes the main changes in the IRMF compared to the previous frameworks. In addition to having a single results management framework now, better alignment is provided with other existing frameworks, such as the initial investment framework. The overall number of indicators has been reduced, and better linkages between core indicators and sub-indicators, or what used to be impact indicators and outcome indicators in the RMF PMF, are established, especially for adaptation. Additionally, there are improvements on the measurement of paradigm shift and systemic change. The roles and responsibilities of various stakeholders are better defined now, and upon approval by the board, a comprehensive results handbook for the IRMF will be available, which is also a new element of this framework. This slide shows the changes that occurred in the result levels compared to the previous frameworks, RMF and PMF. As you can see, the GCF impact level under the IRMF is now defined as paradigm shift potential, while the original impact and outcome levels are merged into GCF outcomes consisting of two distinct elements, impact potential and enabling environment. Finally, similarly to the previous frameworks, project-specific outcomes and outputs are measured through project-specific indicators. And now you can see in more detail what the new RMF looks like. At impact level, paradigm shift potential is measured across 3 dimensions, namely scale, replicability, and sustainability. This also allows the GCF to better measure its contribution to the goals of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. At outcome level, there are 2 specific sets of indicators: quantitative core and sub-indicators that measure the contribution to mitigation and adaptation. And these indicators are aggregated at portfolio level, as well as a mixture of qualitative and quantitative indicators that measure the contribution to enabling environment. This set of indicators also allows the fund to better measure the contribution to sustainable development. Finally, the IRMF maintains the use of project-specific indicators at outcome and output level, in addition to the IRMF indicators, but puts stronger emphasis on the measurement of potential co-benefits, such as gender or development. I believe that after this overview, there is no further need for me to justify why changes in the funding proposal template are required. This was also the view of the board in its B29 decision when the Secretariat was mandated as part of the IRMF implementation to update the FP template. The main changes are made in section E, the logical framework, although some changes were also needed in other sections such as section A and section B. Please allow me now to move to the next part of the presentation and explain together with Shahid the detailed changes in each section. Let me start with section A. One of the main changes in section A is in 8.4, where accredited entities are required now to report not only the use of GCF financing for result areas, but also the use of co-financing. As co-financing is an integral element of every project, having that new additional column allows us to better measure the contribution of each individual project to the 8 GCF result areas. The information required for filling this new column can be obtained from section C of the funding proposal template, as we will shortly explain. There were also some terminological changes to align the funding proposal templates with the updated result language. For example, sections A5 and 8.6 now talk about mitigation and adaptation outcomes and not mitigation and adaptation impact. With this, I would like to give the floor to Shahid, who will take us through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Vlad, for the overview and covering select sections of the FP. A big thank you to all the esteemed participants. I would now like to walk you through the remaining sections of the FP template with the highlight of key changes. The section A has already been covered by Vlad, so we move forward with section B, which covers project program information. The major change in section B relates to a split of the section B2. The section B2 has been divided into 2 subsections, B2A, that will include TOC narrative and diagram, and B2B, that relates to outcome mapping to GCF results, areas, and co-benefit categorization. You can see in the table that the TOC section has been named as B2A. The section gives more emphasis on capturing co-benefits under the TOC as encouraged by the IRMF. The TOC template has been updated accordingly. With that, let's have a closer look at the TOC diagram and major changes. While the TOC steps remain the same for the updated FP template, the key change brought by the IRMF is that the goal statement within a TOC is now considered a context-specific paradigm shift, which a project program will aim to support and contribute to. The concept of viewing a project program's goal statement as equivalent to contribution to paradigm shift is based on the IRMF structure, where the paradigm shift is placed at the highest level of result or impact, followed by outcome, project program, outputs, and activities. By applying the same concept the proposed project program should develop a TOC that has a goal statement summarizing a project program specific paradigm shift and describes how the shift should be contributed towards by using results chain links from activities, outputs to outcomes. Therefore, TOC is essentially an illustration of how and why a desired paradigm shift is expected to happen in the context of a project program. Another change is about inclusion of co-benefits. The example TOC diagram has been updated as portrayed in the slide to facilitate the identification and monitoring of a wide range of co-benefits by AEs, based on the concept that co-benefits are part of the broader outcomes of project program interventions. They are located at the same level as project program outcomes in this updated TOC diagram, but are differentiated from the primary, that is mitigation or adaptation outcomes, by dotted lines and arrows. As pointed out by Vlad earlier in his presentation, the terminologies have been updated to align with IRMF, that is, impact equals paradigm shift. Co-benefits have been added at the same level as outcomes, and project levels are now outputs. This slide takes a closer look at the section D2B. When completing the table, AEs should consider which GCF result areas each project outcome is contributing towards. While it is recommended that each project program outcome corresponds to one result area, it is possible that an outcome can contribute to more than one result area. If any co-benefits are identified in the TOC, AEs are requested to fill the co-benefit categorization table in this section, similar to the outcome to GCF result area mapping table. Each co-benefit from the TOC developed in section D2A can be mapped to one or more of the co-benefit categories by marking X's in the co-benefit categorization table. Moving on, this slide shows the changes in section B3 and B6. For section B3, some of the terms have been redefined to increase clarity and consistency across the funding proposal. In section B6, the focus has now changed from sustainability to exit strategy, while sustainability of a project program has been moved to section E, that is log frame in line with the IRMF results structure. With that, we have covered section B, and now I would like to move on to section C, which is about financial information. You will note that there are no significant changes in this section. Some clarifications have been added to section C.2, financing by component, in response to AE's feedback. A point to note is that in the updated FP template, these component output costs should include all monitoring and evaluation related costs, except the cost of interim and final evaluation, which are covered by AE fees. Moving on, we now come to section D of the funding proposal that covers performance against investment criteria. Here again, you can notice that there are not many significant changes as they relate mostly to alignment of terminologies and clarifications. A minor modification has been made in section D2 to clarify the linkage between a project program's TOC and paradigm shift, which were highlighted earlier during the presentation. As noted under section B2A above, the goal statement, which a TOC is now considered a context-specific contribution to paradigm shift, which a project program will aim to support. Hope we have been able to provide you a clear understanding of major changes in the sections of the FP up to section D. With that, I would now like to present the changes in section E on the logical framework. This section contains some of the major changes. So let's have a look in a bit of detail. In this slide, we have tried to capture a snapshot of the key changes in the log frame. It is now structured around the three result levels of the IRMF. A, impact, paradigm shift. B, two layers of outcomes, mitigation and adaptation, as well as enabling environment outcomes. And C, project program levels. We'll have further deep dive into each subsections in the slides that are coming up next. As you know, the log frame contains several subsections. This slide shows the changes in E.1 and E.2 subsections. The section E.1 has been updated to align with the IRMF language. As per the previous practice, AEs are requested to tick the relevant box as to whether the proposed project is focused on mitigation or on adaptation. A new section, E.2, on GCF impact level, paradigm shift potential has been brought in that. And that is in line with the IRMF, where a project program is expected to monitor and assess how it contributes to a project program specific paradigm shift by applying three assessment dimensions: scale, replicability, and sustainability. This slide presents the changes in section E.3. As described earlier, the IRMF replaces the GCF's initial results management framework. Accordingly, under the updated section E3, which is at the outcome level, reduced emissions and increased resilience, AEs are now expected to review the IRMF core and supplementary indicators to identify which indicators the proposed project program should monitor for relevant project program outcomes, also taking into account the GCF result areas that the project program is aligned with. In the previous version of the FP template, the PMF indicators, including core, fund level impacts, and fund level outcome indicators, were listed in section E3, 4, and 5, respectively. These PMF indicators are now replaced with IRMF core 1 to 4 and supplementary indicators under section E3 of the updated FP template. With regard to this slide, it shows introduction of a new section E.4 to accommodate the new IRMF core indicators 5 to 8, measuring contribution to enabling environments for a paradigm shift. More details will be presented during the next presentations by my other colleagues, which will contain examples as well. We are coming towards the end of my presentation. This slide covers the last section, that is E5, where only minor modifications have been made. The key change relates to the addition of a co-benefit indicator table with a view of supporting AEs to monitor co-benefit results of respective project program as encouraged by the IRMF. Last but not least, the changes in SAP FP template have also been made to ensure consistency across the FP templates of GCF. In that respect, the changes discussed so far have also been made to the corresponding sections of the SAP FP template, where section A4, A5, A6 in the PAP template correspond to A6, A71, A72, respectively, in the SAP template. Section B2A, B2B, B6 in the PAP template correspond to B21, B22, and C5, respectively, in the SAP template. A key point to note is that the Section E logical framework in the PAP template has been consolidated under a separate annex called Annex 2A in the SAP template. I believe that we have been able to shed some light on the major changes made in the FP template. I'm sure more clarity will emerge with the presentation of case studies that will also contain examples. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Vlad and Shahid, for a very informative and detailed introduction to the FP template. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar, so if you have questions on the presentation, please write them down using the chat button. Also, as a reminder, the presentation and the videos will be posted on the events webpage following this event. So if you need to go back over any information detailed here, you can do that. Our second presentation will provide a case study and give further details on the FP template. Kyung Lee and Yunika Anna Aure, both monitoring and evaluation specialists in the Division of Portfolio Management, will lead the presentation. Over to you.
Welcome to the second presentation of today's session. My name is Kyung-cheol Lee. I'm a specialist in the Division of Portfolio Management of the GCF. In this presentation, I will walk you through a case study which is prepared to provide detailed guidance of how updated FP template can be developed accordingly. I will cover the first half of this presentation, and my colleague Yunika, another M&E specialist, will guide you the second half. Please raise any questions or comments that you may have through question button, including those for the first presentation. After this presentation, we will have a Q&A session to address your questions, as many as possible. So before we deep dive into the detail, kindly note the following points. First, this case study is a hypothetical project designed only for guidance purpose. Each project has unique development and climate context, so this case study is not meant to be the best example for all FP development. Second, this is a cross-cutting project targeting transport sector to cover both mitigation and adaptation research areas. Third, the case project example will cover only section B and E, where the most substantial changes are made. For more details regarding other sections, please refer to the guidance note, which was published on the GCF website on 19th of January. Finally, the sections mentioned are based on PAP FP template, but same guidance can be applied to SAP SEP template as well, as clarified in the guidance note. So this is the brief introduction of the case study. I'm not going to read this all, but only highlight some important elements of the project which are involved. This is a project of building a segregated, low emission and climate resilient bus rapid transit, BRT. The zero GHG emission biomethane buses will be running, and the public transport system will be less vulnerable to climate risk. Therefore, the project is considered to be cross-cutting. Besides climate research, improved air quality and more business opportunities are identified as co-benefits. More information of the case study can be found in the guidance note. Let's move now to section B of updated FP template. As introduced in the first presentation, this is the updated TOC template. You can see it here. GCF impact is now linked to the measurement of paradigm shift potential and there are co-benefits at outcome level. The rest of template remains almost the same, but for barriers and risks, we would like to recommend clearly identifying them in the TOC template as well. Let's move to the project TOC. This is the TOC of the case project. If, then, because statements are made at impact level, and we will see separately in the next slide. At outcome level, there are 3 outcomes. First, transport system becomes less vulnerable to climate extremes. Second, reduce GHG emission from transport. 3, improve public and private sector's regulatory capacity. There are also co-benefits. Increased use of public transport, which is a bit ambiguous. So let me come back to this point later. And another co-benefits is improved air quality. As you can see, there are arrows that show the logical linkages between research, even for the co-benefits. Air quality can be improved when the second outcome of reduced GHG emission will be realized. As I mentioned before, it is indicated in the box whether it is barrier or risk. So there is no big change in terms of its structuring, but let's focus on some details at impact and outcome level. Now that we have paradigm shift for GCF impact level, as you can see on the left-hand side, the goal statement in the TOC should contain a context-specific paradigm shift element. If I make it very simple, if statement should describe project outputs, because statement should describe project outcomes, and then statement should embrace the context-specific paradigm shift potential. If you look at the case study, because statement describes project adaptation and mitigation outcomes, while then statement describes how the project will contribute to city's GHG reduction target at high level, which is understood as the city-specific paradigm shift. When it goes to outcomes in the TOC, each project or program outcome, whether it is a mitigation or adaptation outcome, should be linked to one or more of the GCF reserve areas as required by the IRMF. As you can see, there are 3 outcomes, and it is recommended for you to think against which GCF reserve areas they will be mapped. When you do this, please also consider which GCF indicators can be used for those outcomes. For example, the first outcome can be linked to GCF reserve area 3, which is infrastructure and built environment, and core indicator 2, which is number of beneficiaries, and also core indicator 3, the value of physical assets made more resilient, can be chosen for the first outcome. And regarding co-benefits, as a practical tip, it is recommended to identify co-benefits after all climate-related research pathways are built in the TOC. We start with climate problems and issues and come up with activities to tackle them and expected research. Co-benefits might not be part of this research chain, but during or after developing TOC, they can be eventually recognized. Please don't forget to show logical linkages with other research using dotted lines for co-benefits. For instance, air quality, in this case project, air quality improvement is not primary objective of this project. However, if the project reduces the GHG emission from transport sector, then eventually it is expected that the air quality of the city can be improved. Then we can put this as environmental co-benefit. So this is a summary showing how outcomes and co-benefits can be mapped out. Outcome 1 aligns with adaptation reserve area, which is ARA3, infrastructure and environment. By implementing a climate-proof BRT infrastructure, the project is expected to reduce the vulnerability of the transport system to climate hazard. Outcome 2 relate to mitigation reserve area 2, as the reductions are caused by the development of a low-emission transport system. Outcome 3 focuses on improving institutional and regulatory frameworks required for low-emission and climate-resilient transport. So it aligns with both mitigation reserve area 2 and adaptation reserve area 3. As you can see in the table below, co-benefit 1 can be linked to economic and gender co-benefits categories. Given the project will also contribute to the development of jobs and economic opportunities for stalls in stations, including women-led businesses. Co-benefit 2 relates to environmental co-benefit, so that environmental co-benefit box can be ticked. Let me show you the actual table. So this is what a completed outcome reserved area mapping table will look like. Once all the mapping is done, marked reserved areas need to be reflected in section E of logical framework and the relevant IRMF indicators selected. For example, for this case study, mitigation reserve area 2 and adaptation reserve area 3 are marked by project outcomes, as you can see in the screen. Then IRMF core or supplementary indicators, which are relevant for mitigation reserve area 2 and adaptation reserve area 3, have to be identified as fund level outcome indicators in section E3. Pertinent indicators can be chosen based on what we could achieve from each project outcome. In the same manner, co-benefits can be categorized per type, and then they will be monitored with their own indicators in section E of the logical framework. So my colleague Yunika will explain more about the development of the logical framework. With this, I'd like to give the floor to Yunika, who will take us through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Kyung, and a very good day again to everyone. So in this second part of the presentation, I will walk you through section E, logical framework of the funding proposal template. As mentioned, significant changes have been made to this section. Specifically, these changes are in sections E1, E2, E3, E4, and E5. And in this presentation, we will focus on sections E2 to E5, since E1 is a matter of classifying the projects or programs focus. Recall that these sections are now structured around the IRMF's 3 result levels, namely the impact level or the paradigm shift potential, the outcome level, which includes the reduced emissions and increased resilience indicators or the mitigation and adaptation outcomes, as well as the enabling environment outcomes. And lastly, the project or program specific indicators, which now includes a clear specification of co-benefit indicators in a table. Visually, this is how section E corresponds to the IRMF architecture. In the following slides, we will go through these result areas from top to bottom, starting with section E2, which covers the paradigm shift potential, and we will end with the project and program results, E5. So now let us start with section E2. Section E2 should capture the relationship between the project and the 3 paradigm shift dimensions. And for each dimension, the baseline context and scores must be provided. Similarly, a narrative for the project's paradigm shift potential and how the project will contribute to this potential has to be provided. So you can see here a completed table for illustration purposes only. Please note that the actual assessment of the paradigm shift potential will be done as part of the interim and final evaluations of each project by independent evaluators. So zooming in on our case study, let's take a closer look at the first paradigm shift dimension of scale. In this cross-cutting transport example, please remember that first, completing the table is mostly a qualitative exercise, meaning you are not expected to specify quantitative metrics and estimates for each paradigm shift dimension. Second, the baseline cutoff point has to be specified, keeping in mind that at times there is a long lag between FP formulation and the start of implementation, and this would normally require updating the baseline scenarios during inception. The baseline cutoff will serve as your reference point in future assessments, and therefore it is critical that the most appropriate starting point is specified. In this example, you will see that the entry indicates that the baseline scenario was as at the FP development stage, with the possibility of going further to specify the exact time frame. Third, it is useful to cross-reference the outcomes identified in B2A in the narrative, because these outcomes logically could contribute towards the project's or program's paradigm shift potential. Notice that in the 4th and 5th columns, familiar outcomes such as the increased use of public transport and emissions reductions were weaved into the narrative. And lastly, be succinct and follow the required limit of 50 words for this section's descriptive elements. So moving on to section E3, this section focuses on the GCF's mitigation and adaptation outcomes. And here you can see again a completed table for E3. The case study identifies 3 IRMF indicators, all of which are core indicators. It is important that you identify and select all core and supplementary indicators that are relevant to your project or program. Please note that the final indicator reference sheets will be available in the IRMF Results Handbook once approved by the GCF board. Disaggregation of targets, as illustrated, is not a new requirement, but we would like to emphasize its importance when reporting against core indicator 2 on direct and indirect adaptation beneficiaries. And if reporting against core indicator 1 on GHG emissions reduction, include the lifespan target of GHG emission as an assumption. The BRT project, our case study, was classified as a cross-cutting project, and therefore core indicators 1 and 2 have been included. Note that these 2 indicators are required. Core indicator 1 must be included for all mitigation projects and programs, and core indicator 2 should be tracked and monitored for adaptation projects and programs. Let's now take a look at section E4. Similar to sections E2 and E3, E4 is new. It incorporates the new IRMF outcome indicators 5 to 8, which relate to contributions to enabling environment. At least 2 indicators should be selected for monitoring and reporting. And please note that for this section, similar to E2, the actual assessment of the contribution to enabling environment will be done as part of the interim and final evaluations of each project by independent evaluators. In our case study, all 4 enabling environment indicators have been selected. You will notice on this table that the baseline context, baseline rating, and project contribution columns are similar to E2. These columns require the specification of a qualitative baseline, the use of a scorecard for the self-assessment, and a brief description of how exactly the project or program will contribute to each of the selected enabling environment indicator. Importantly, Section E4 also includes the coverage column. Context matters when assessing enabling environment, and thus in this column, the unit of analysis must be clearly identified. In this case, coverage has been differentiated by indicator, ranging from the national level for core indicator 5 to multi-countries for core indicator 8. And finally, for the target scenario column, state the change to the enabling environment that the project or program will support. For instance, under core indicator 5, the target scenario highlights the regulatory framework in place to support the shifting of public transport fleets to greener alternatives, as well as to strengthen institutional capacity for the effective development, procurement, oversight, and management of green public mass transit in the city. And again, it is important to be brief and precise in these descriptions. So on to our final section, Section E5. This section has in essence two components. First is the specification of the project or program level results, and second is the newly introduced co-benefits table. For the project or program level results, a numbering schema has been introduced to strengthen the consistency of project or program structure throughout different components of the funding proposal. For example, and focusing on just one of the three outcomes from our case study, specifically for outcome 3, improved public and private sector capacity and regulatory environment, the corresponding outputs have been labeled as output 3.1 and output 3.2. This is a simple enough cosmetic change that should facilitate the matching of the outcomes with the relevant outputs that are expected to contribute towards their achievement. However, the key change in Section E5 relates to the addition of a separate co-benefits indicators table. This change was introduced to support AEs to monitor better the co-benefit outcomes of projects or programs, as the IRMF encourages. In our case study, you will recall that two co-benefits have been identified: the increased use of public transport and improved air quality. Similar to the main outcomes, E5 requires that specific indicators, means of verification, baseline, midterm, and final targets and assumptions are specified for the co-benefits, as this table demonstrates. And that wraps up this case study presentation. Thank you for staying with us till the end, and we look forward to your questions and clarifications in the subsequent Q&A part of the program.
Thank you, Kyung and Unica, for that interesting presentation showing application to GCF projects. Dear participants, in this next portion of the webinar program, we will have a question and answer session. Many of you have already submitted your written questions through the chat button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we invite all of you to continue sending your questions or comments throughout the rest of the session. We have about 40 minutes remaining in our presentation. We will try to get to as many questions as we can before our time is up. But before we start, I would like to introduce our Q&A panelists today. First, we have Vladislav Arnaudov, Senior Quality Assurance and Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist from the Division of Portfolio Management. Aiko Ward, Data Management Specialist from DPM as well. And Kyung Lee, the Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist from DPM. So I'm going to start off the question and answer session here with kind of some basic high level questions. And the first one that I want to get to is, what are the major differences between the previous results management framework and performance management framework and the integrated results management framework that's presented here? So maybe Vlad, if I could turn that one over to you to start with.
Thank you. Thank you very much, team. And once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who is joining us on this webinar today. This is a great question, and it's very important to clarify actually what has really changed. And probably the first and the most important part of my answer is that the new framework is much better structured compared to the previous RMF and PMF. We had basically two frameworks that we had to manage, as all of you know. Now it is consolidated in one single framework. Another issue that we had with the previous framework, which we have significantly improved now, are the linkages between the different result levels, especially in relation to adaptation. In the PMF, we had the outcome and impact indicators for adaptation, for example, but sometimes it is very difficult to see how those are linked. And now we have established a very clear system of core and sub-indicators, and the linkages between the different result levels have been made much, much clearer. Another new element is the enabling environment measurement. It is coming also from the RMF and PMF, but it has been strengthened now. And we also now have a new system for measuring paradigm shift, as you also saw in the presentation. The number of the indicators has been reduced, and I think this is something that is going to help everybody who is working with the GCF. And we also clarified the definition of the different indicators, including to a result handbook, which once approved by the GCF board is going to be available to everybody. And we maintained sufficient flexibility for ACE to use project-specific indicators as well, in addition to the IRMF indicators, so that we are allowed to measure various project-specific features. And the IRMF also put very strong emphasis on co-benefits in cases when those are applicable. So in summary, the new system is much better structured, it's easier to apply, and it allows for more systematic result collection and reporting. Thank you.
Thanks, Vlad, for that explanation. That's really helpful. I know there's a lot of questions also about the timing of all these and when these should be applied. And so the next question I want to cover is there a grace period for resubmissions of funding proposals that did not get tabled or approved to the next board meeting? And so maybe for that one, could I turn it over to Kyung for that one?
Yes, thank you, team, and thanks. Big thank to all partner AEs who are staying with us today. Yes, the simple answer will be yes. I mean, as announced with the official launch of revised FP template, the updated FP templates are required to be used from the 32nd board meeting and onwards. So simply saying all existing pipeline funding proposals, including resubmission for board consideration, from simply B32, I have to say should use the new version of the FP template. Yeah, and that is the simple answer. And probably, Aiko, could you explain a bit further about the future timeline, if we have some? Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Kang, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for being here. So just to clarify in terms of the overall IRMF implementation timeline, we have a quite number of initiatives that's happening under the umbrella framework of implementation of the IRMF. So that includes this, what we are covering today in this webinar, that's the update of the FP template. But we also have this results handbook that's being developed currently and waiting for board's approval. That's also going to be a big help for accredited entities in terms of applying the IRMF in the future. So that's coming up, and we're trying to get that document approved by the GCF board in the upcoming board board meeting. So that's another thing. And we also have a new dedicated funding window being launched for direct access entities to help them implement the IRMF. So that is also being launched actually tomorrow, and it's going to be opened up. So there's a series of activities happening under the implementation of the IRMF. So hopefully all this will support accredited entities to implement IRMF. So I hope that that is helpful, and happy to answer any follow-up questions. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Aiko and Kyung. Okay, so turning to some questions here from the audience, there's been a few questions here related to co-benefits, and I think it would be useful to cover those in a little more detail as well. So if a project is focused on adaptation, should mitigation potential benefits be treated as co-benefits? For example, not selecting both the adaptation and mitigation results areas. And then recognizing, of course, that co-benefits can be subjective and not necessarily responding directly to interventions and affected by external factors not controlled by the implementation of the project. For example, the air quality measure in terms of the short-term project need could be a really big program to make changes, and it could improve air quality, but it might be complex to measure and link it to the major results areas. So maybe, Vlad, could I turn it over to you for a little bit of discussion on co-benefits and how they're handled in this?
Thank you, Tim. So let me start answering with the first part of the co-benefit question, especially in relation to mitigation co-benefits and adaptation co-benefits, and also turn over to Aiko for the second part of the question. Actually, there has been a long-standing discussion with GCF projects, and even if you look at the previous RMF, PMF, it was talking about adaptation co-benefits in mitigation projects, for example, and we have a number of adaptation projects with mitigation co-benefits and mitigation projects with adaptation co-benefit. What we try to do under the RMF is first clarify and further confirm that these co-benefits exist, adaptation and mitigation co-benefits. And in the guidance note, we provided a very clear box explanation of what the differences between mitigation and adaptation co-benefits are compared to what we call a cross-cutting project. And I think this is actually where the first question is actually coming from. So maybe it would be good for me to explain what a cross-cutting project is, and that will provide a good background of what will be the mitigation co-benefit in an adaptation project compared to that. So if you have a cross-cutting project or program, you should be able to clearly articulate both the mitigation and the adaptation rationale, basically going through establishing rigorous GHG methodologies for mitigation and climate models for adaptation to show that there is both mitigation and adaptation impact. That will allow you, first of all, to measure what the impact is going to be in terms of GHG emissions or in terms of beneficiaries or other impacts. But you also, in a cross-cutting project, you should be able to show the intentionality that you are targeting both mitigation and adaptation. Now, if you are lacking one of those elements, you're going to have an adaptation project with mitigation co-benefits, for example. So if your project is really focusing on adaptation and you do not have targeted mitigation efforts, and you also cannot measure the mitigation impact using rigorous GHG methodologies, but probably some very high level estimates, then you're going to talk about an adaptation project only. And in section E5, you're going to include the mitigation co-benefit. So this is the way the differentiation is made. That differentiation is actually not only in the coming from the IRMF. This is something that has been around for a while. We're just trying to clarify it also within the scope of the IRMF. So I'll be very happy to discuss this in cases of individual projects with our partner ACE and provide further guidance offline. But maybe on the second part of the question, I would like to invite also Aiko to comment on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vlad. And I think maybe just to be clear in terms of that question, I can perhaps repeat the, I guess, very good discussion point for this related to co-benefit. So the question was really that the point was, you know, the co-benefit can be subjective and sometimes doesn't respond directly to interventions and mostly can easily be affected by external factors. And so let's say measuring air quality, it can happen in a big program, but may be difficult to monitor in a particular project or program. And I think this is a very, very good point. So thank you for raising this today for our discussion. So I think our position is that, yes, absolutely right. The core benefits, you know, it's sometimes it's, as we say in the definition, it's a secondary outcomes and it is not targeted, and it's something that we like to monitor as part of the implementation, but not as a primary intended outcomes, as a secondary outcome. And in order to monitor co-benefits, we are not requiring accredited entity to employ or apply rigorous M&E methodologies. It's rather, as I think Vlad just highlighted, it's high level. And what do we mean by high level? It could be in a way of qualitative approach, if that's the methodology that accredited entity would like to employ. And so there are different ways to monitor. I think the important message is that we are, as a GCF, trying to achieve results in 8 results areas that we have. However, we also consider important to see any benefits that might be deriving from, outside of the results area, or as Vlad mentioned, sometimes mitigation intervention can create additional adaptation outcomes. So this type of outcomes, secondary though, not primary, we like to measure. We want to be able to monitor them. So that's the intention. And I think it goes the same in terms of subjective, and then it's also very difficult to measure in the long term. Absolutely right. And the same argument goes for the primary outcomes. GCF, we are not requiring accredited entities to basically we're not claiming attribution. We are trying to measure contribution to outcomes, whether it's intended or primary outcomes or the secondary outcomes. So in this case, we refer to co-benefits. And what is important is that with we are not asking AEs to basically say that it's not attributed by the project. So hopefully that that clarification, it's contribution that we are trying to measure. It's not the attribution. Hope that clarifies the difference. And yeah, hopefully that answers the question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Aiko. Okay, so a similar question here coming from the submitted questions. So the same output can impact 2 different outcomes. For example, increasing use of public transport can decrease emissions and improve resilience. So how will this one output be reflected in the project level indicators? Kyung, could you take that one?
Sure. Thanks, team. Before I answer to this question, I mean, just briefly complementing to what Aiko and Vlad mentioned about co-benefit. I mean, yeah, so they've already covered almost everything, but the co-benefit is a secondary and auxiliary result we do not want to miss. Yes, it is subjective, but this is why we mark those co-benefits using dotted lines in the TOC, and they are not going to be aggregated at the phone level. And the coming back to the question, Thank you. It is absolutely true. One output can contribute to more than one outcomes. It's very true. And we, GCF, welcome this complexity of TOC instead of having linear causal relationship between research or activities. So yeah, it's true. And if one output has more than one relationship with outcomes, um, their indicators can be identified in the section E.5 of logical framework, since all the output indicators are considered project specific. So for instance, in the case study we've just presented, one of the output is climate-proof infrastructure completed. So for this output, indicators can be the number of completed infrastructure and the specification of them, like number of stations or kilometers of BRT system completed. So please identify those project-specific indicators in the section E5 of the logical framework for those output level research. Thank you.
Thank you, Kung, for that explanation. There have been a number of questions here about the gender indicators as well. So are we expecting to complement the IRMF with gender indicators in the gender action plan, or the new gender co-benefit indicators? Will they be the only gender indicators? So maybe could you provide a little explanation on the how the gender indicators will feed into this or be integrated into the IRMF? Let's see, who wants to take that one here?
Maybe I can start, Tim, and then I'll hand over to the rest of the panel. And thank you for this very good question. So there are two aspects that I want to emphasize. First of all, in the IRMF, all relevant indicators are gender disaggregated. So that part is already taken care of. And this is something that I would say is one of the biggest achievements of the IRMF compared to the previous result management system. The second thing is that in addition to the approved IRMF indicators, ACE have the opportunity to also include their own project-specific indicators in section E5. So there can be additional gender-related indicators to be included there. And of course, the gender action plan can have its own set of gender-related indicators. So there are three aspects of that. They're already covered by the integrated result management framework. But maybe Aiko would like to add a little bit more in that aspect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vlad. So I think, yeah, once again, very good question. And I think it's important that there's always linkage between different documents and annexes, and then at the template main section as well. And I think this question really asks that linkage matter. So thank you for that. And so as Vlad highlighted, I think it's important that we first identify in the gap, the gender action plan and assessment, what are the gender related impact or the outcomes we might have as a result of implementing a project or program. So that detailed analysis, situational analysis related to gender issues, that can be, of course, elaborated in that annex. And then, of course, as a result, you might be able to come up with some of the indicators that are specifically related to gender. Or it could be that some indicator within the project program specific, a log frame, you might consider you would like to disaggregate by female or male, by sex. So that type of analysis should be able to, that can happen as a part of completing the section, the annex gender action plan. And then, of course, you can reconsider back into the log frame. So then in our log frame, what would be the specific indicator that would really impact in terms of the gender role, or a gender-related intervention. What is it that we are trying to achieve? So that can come as a gender co-benefit under Section E5. So hopefully that linkage clarifies in terms of what needs to come under the gap and then what needs to come under Section E5. Yeah, with that, hand it over to you, Tim. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for those replies. I want to shift a little bit to guidance and supplementary information, and a couple of questions here. So first, are there supplementary documents that will assist in completing the funding proposal? And then also, I know many of you will be aware that there have been several sectoral guide sessions in 2021, have all been approved to assist in the drafting of funding proposals in line with the IRMF. Vlad, could I turn that over to you?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim, for this question. Again, very interesting. Well, we are planning, and we have already started supplying a number of different resources to accredited entities. A couple of days ago, we already published the guidance note for completing the FP. So I would say this is like the first document that supplements the work of the IRMF in relation to funding proposals. As it was mentioned already in the presentations, as well as in the answers by some of the colleagues, we have prepared a result handbook. We are aiming to have it approved as soon as possible, and but it's really up to the board to decide when that is going to happen. But what I can assure everybody is that the moment this result handbook is approved, it is going to be available to all accredited entities. And the whole goal of the result handbook, and this is why the board also agreed in having that document, is really to clarify the definition of indicators, the methodologies to be applied for different indicators. So that is also going to be made available. Another thing that we are working on at the moment is training on the development of theory of change. Theory of change has been something that has been bothering a lot of our partners for quite some time, and we have decided that it is time the Secretariat prepared a training where ACE can be guided on how to structure and develop a good theory of change. So that training material is also going to be made available within the coming few months. As soon as it is ready, you're going to be informed about that. So there are a number of other trainings that we are also planning over the coming year to support accredited entities. Of course, as Lillian mentioned in her opening remarks, the Secretariat staff also stands ready to work with ACE on individual projects because we are going to be in a transition process for a couple of months until everybody gets used to that. And of course, tomorrow there'll be the webinars in the morning and in the evening about the direct access entities funding window, and that will be a financial support that ACE will receive also as part of this transition process. So in summary, we are here and working with ACE to and ready to support them to really get through this transition process with different materials, with our own support, with trainings, with guidance notes. So please don't hesitate to contact us in case, of course, you have any questions. So that is, I think, regarding the first part of your question. And there was also another part of how the IRMF is really linked also to the sector guides. I think that was that is also a very important element. Probably it's important to clarify one point that has been recurring, that the sector guides are focusing on our programming efforts, and the result management framework is really about how the GCF is managing the results of approved project. We when the indicators in the IRMF have been developed, of course, they've been we've been focusing also in the existing result areas and taking into consideration the sector guide. So that is in place, and we are making sure that the work on the way forward, we are also moving in harmony with the existing documents. And probably that's also an important point to say, that as a beauty of the IRMF, that finally it is very well aligned with the other frameworks that exist within the Secretariat. Let me stop here. I don't know whether any other colleagues from the panel want to supplement that. Thank you.
Nothing to add, Vlad. Thank you.
No, I think you've covered all. Thank you.
Okay, in that case, let's move on to the next question. And Vlad, I know you mentioned the theory of change a bit there, and how it's a challenging topic for many of our AE partners. And I was just wondering, maybe if we could go into a little more detail in the next few minutes about how the theory of change is developed. How can context-specific paradigm shift potential be described using the if, then, or because statements? Kyung, could I turn that one over to you?
Yes, thanks, team. Let me try to respond, and I will ask Vlad to come in. Yes, so as you can see in the presentation, the paradigm shift, I mean, in the TOC, the goal statement is the one of the most significant change in the IRMF. So now in the IRMF result architecture, the paradigm shift potential is placed at the highest level of the result as impact level result. So when project level TOC is developed, those paradigm shift potentials should be captured and described in impact level, which means using if, then, because statements. So as I said before, if we understand this very simply, the logical consequences between if, then, because statement can be if comes first, then not then statement, then because statement, and then finally then statements, which will represent final changes. So having said that, in the simple case project, you can see because statements includes those mitigation and adaptation result or outcomes that the project is seeking for, and then statement tries to describe the project-specific paradigm shift potential in this hypothetical city where the project will be implemented. The project will, so it is a holistic approach of how the project will be supporting paradigm shift in terms of scale, replicability, and sustainability. And in this example, it says like it will contribute to the city's vision of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we would like to encourage AEs to develop this goal statement using if, then, because statement to describe the high-level paradigm shift potential, how the project can be contributing to these paradigm shift change at a high level. And Vlad or Aiko, would you like to come in?
Maybe, John, I think you covered it very well, so nothing significant to add from my side, but probably the only thing that is important to emphasize here is that what follows after the then part of the if, then, because statement is where you really have to describe what exactly is going to be the paradigm shifting effect. And this is the part that is slightly new compared to what we had previously. So in the then part of the sentence, you can put your vision about the paradigm shift that is already articulated in other parts of the funding proposal. That's the only thing that I wanted to add from my side. Thank you.
Great, thanks for those responses. And I know that we're standing by ready to help AEs work through some of these issues on individual projects as well. So we're getting close to the end of our time. We've run through the questions submitted by the audience. So maybe I'll ask now if any of our panelists want to add any closing remarks before we wrap up the session.
So maybe I can just start with that. And I want to thank, first of all, everybody on the panel for participating here today and our audience for being so active and joining us. I know for many of you, this is quite late on your side of the world, or quite early. So we really appreciate your interest in this. I want to emphasize that the Secretariat stands ready to work with all of you. It's going to be a process of mutual learning, but as I said in my presentation, the other panelists also mentioned, we're developing a number of support materials, and we as a Secretariat also stand ready to work with all of you. So thank you so much for your participation today.
Okay, thank you. So we're coming to the end of the session, and I'd like to thank all of you for your interest and participation in this webinar. Thank you again to our panelists for their presentations and for their answers to questions. Video recording on the presentation will be posted on the event webpage. We will notify all attendees by email after the event once the recording has been posted online. I'd also like to give a big thank you to the GCF events team and our information communication technology team who supported us today. We invite you to visit our website at greenclimate.fund/events to learn more about this event and other past and upcoming GCF events. Stay safe, thank you, and have a great day.